Thank you again for joining us this morning. Welcome to today's research webinar, uncovering the impacts of the federal tax credit on EV leasing and purchasing. My name is Sarah Schramer. I'm the Policy Director at the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. Housed at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, or NCST, is part of the University Transportation Centers program administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. The NCST provides national leadership in advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. UC Davis leads the NCST consortium with partner centers at CSU Long Beach, Georgia Tech, Texas Southern University, UC Riverside, University of Southern California, and the University of Vermont. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website along with the presentation slides in the coming days. If you have any technical issues, please let us know in the chat. And during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature that's available with a button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Use the Q&A feature if you have a question for either of our speakers today. And we're going to reserve time after the presentation to get through as many of your questions as we can. And we also have several questions that were submitted through the registration process that we'll try to get to as well. So lastly, you'll see a quick survey at the end of the webinar for you to share your thoughts with us on today's presentations. So please do take a couple of minutes to fill that out. It's anonymous and it really helps us improve our webinars. Let's see. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have Gil Tal with us. He is the director of the EV Research Center at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. Dr. Tal's research focuses on electric vehicle policy, travel behavior, and EV supply chain dynamics. His expertise encompasses various segments of the electric vehicle market, including light-duty, heavy-duty, transit sectors, and studying the impact of incentives and infrastructure in the global electric vehicle market. And we also have Kelly Hoogland with us. She's a third-year Ph.D. candidate in the Transportation Technology and Policy program at UC Davis, and earned a master's in energy systems at UC Davis in 2021. Kelly is interested in exploring the barriers and possible solutions to achieving widespread electric vehicle adoption and researches topics related to incentives and infrastructure. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Gil to give a quick introduction for the presentation and some context for the research.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you here. I will give a little bit of background here, and there are a set of authors on the slide that I'm sure that Kelly will repeat, but I just want to say that Dr. Scott Hardeman is the leader of this project and also Kelly's advisor. He's out of town and I'm covering for him today. And one more kind of a shameless plug before we start. Next week, we are hosting our regular STEP symposium on the 6th and 7th of December. And many of the people that I see at the attendee list here will be there. But if you are not and you're still interested, you can join us. And now let's talk a little bit about today's topic. So in 2015, I checked it yesterday again. The state of California asked us to do a study on incentives for EVs, when the title of the study they asked for was, when can we stop giving incentives? It's already, we're giving it for 4 or 5 years, and that's long enough. When can we stop? It's when is it not going to be important and we can drop this idea of incentives? As you all know, incentives are still here and probably going to stay for a long time, but it's a changing environment, and that's what Kelly is studying, this changing environment. And that's probably part of our discussion at the end of the presentation. The second thing is that back then in 2015, we were not really focusing on lease cars. We were mostly looking at purchase, when lease were kind of these guys that are not willing to commit yet. They're just trying and will drop it later. And that's something we learn over time, that lists are very important. And not just because people can try and then decide, but also because of the need for fast turnover and to create a secondary market and to create a strong EV fleet in California and the US. And it's have much more importance than just a lower commitment level, as we learn. I think that this is really, really important study, and combining the two topics together as part of the work that we were doing in the past, also as part of the path that Kelly is taking, is great. So I'm looking forward to hear the presentation and your questions. And I think that most of the questions Kelly will answer, but if there anything else that I can help, I'll be here in the background. So go ahead.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so again, my name is Kelly Hoogland, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Transportation Technology and Policy program. And today I'm going to be talking about some research we've been doing exploring the impact of the federal tax credit on the decision to purchase or lease a PEV in California. Also, as previously mentioned, this is work I've collaborated on with Dr. Scott Hardman, in addition to Devapriya Chakraborty and Professor David Bunch. Okay, so first, to provide an outline for today's presentation, I'll start by providing an introduction to both the state level and federal level policies for electric vehicles, followed by a closer look at the federal tax credit and how it's administered for purchasers and lessees before the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 and after that, and the implications. Followed by a discussion of the significance of leasing in the PEV market and some US trends. And then an investigation into the purchase versus lease decision, followed by investigating the impact of the federal tax credit for purchasers and lessees. And then lastly, just discussing more of the results from these models, and just to conclude with policy implications. So to introduce, there's several both demand and supply side policies for electric vehicles. And in California, as of September of this year, the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project just retired. It started in 2010. Yeah, that was administered by the Center for Sustainable Energy on behalf of the California Air Resources Board. And the California Air Resources Board is also in charge of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 ruling, which requires that all new vehicle sales be zero emission by 2035. And then at the federal level, there's of course the tax credit, as well as massive investments being made into a national public charging network, known as the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. And then lastly, there's also been recently updated corporate fuel economy standards, which is going to require a drastic increase in the proportion of zero emission vehicles on the road. And so while PEV market shares has grown dramatically in California in particular, they account still for just about a quarter of new vehicle sales, and just 3% of all vehicles on the road, and maybe 4%, maybe it's grown back to 4%. And so this goes to show that there's still a long way to go before we reach mass market penetration. So taking a closer look at the federal tax credit, so before the Inflation Reduction Act, for purchasers of plug-in electric vehicles, this incentive you could receive this credit when filing for annual taxes, but receiving the full credit amount was subject to having high enough taxable income. And if your income was below a certain threshold, you would not receive the full amount. And alternatively, for lessees, since leased PEVs are considered to be commercial vehicles, the credit is claimed by the dealership. And then while the dealership doesn't have any obligation to, they use the credit to subsidize the down and monthly payments. And also important to note is that before the IRA, lessees had little to no awareness of how the federal tax credit was being subsidized into their lease cost. So as of 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act incurred several changes. And so firstly, it removed the 200,000 vehicles sales cap that had previously been in place. And brands such as Tesla and Chevrolet had reached the sales cap as of 2018 and 2019, respectively. And so the federal tax credit had been phased out for these brands, but is now, they are now eligible again. However, there's new stipulations for requirements on where the batteries are manufactured, with a certain proportion having to be in the United States, as well as requirements for critical material extraction, and also MSRP caps and buyer's income caps. And in addition, as of 2024, so in a few months, purchasers may be able to transfer this credit to a dealership and receive it at the point of payment in the form of lower down and monthly payments, which would essentially be the same way it works for lessees. However, while the all of the eligibility requirements still stand for this transferability, this could benefit lower and middle income buyers, as you don't have to have a high enough taxable income to still receive the full amount, while it still does have the income cap to prevent higher income buyers from claiming the credit this way. And so alternatively, leased PEVs are exempt from all of the eligibility criteria, including, all of them, including income, purchase price, as well as the manufacturing requirements. And this does create a loophole for consumers to receive the full credit amount if they lease the PEV. And so even though prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, the federal tax credit was administered differently for purchasers and lessees, prior studies have not considered the impact of the federal tax credit on the decision to lease, rather focusing on purchase decisions. And so this slide demonstrates that post-IRA, a lot of auto manufacturers, which were not eligible for the purchase tax credit, are advertising the federal tax credit as an upfront lease bonus. So they're really encouraging leasing by offering the entire credit as an upfront bonus. And this is much different than prior to the IRA, because as previously mentioned, the federal tax credit was not advertised as discounting the lease contract, even though it was subsidizing the lease cost. And so now let's get into just discussing the significance of leasing overall in the PEV market. And so due to the lower ownership period of leasing, which is commonly around 3 years, This can offer substantial savings to consumers who value lower down and monthly payments over having a longer ownership period. And so in this way, leasing could encourage consumers to trial PEVs at a lower cost while lowering the perceived uncertainties of PEV adoption as the technology matures, such as increased electric range over time. And as Gil mentioned, leasing also increases the turnover of PEVs entering the used market, which is important to increase the variety of PEVs accessible to lower and middle income buyers, and also would capture a much larger proportion of the market, considering that 2/3 of households do not buy new vehicles on an annual basis. So the new PEV market is missing out on quite a large proportion of consumers. And so to further demonstrate the impact of leasing on the used market, this slide comes from a survey of PEV owners from 2021. And it was a paper by Scott Hardman and Gil about PEV discontinuance. And so this figure shows that almost 3/4 of PEV lessees returns their lease for either a new PEV or a new gas car, while just 26% decided to purchase the lease. And so also of note with this figure, it shows that while a majority of PEV lessees are continuing with PEV technology, there is about 18% who are going back to a conventional gas car. And so now let's get into the overall trends over time in the US. And so the data for this figure comes from 2013 to 2019, comes from a UC Davis survey. And from 2020 to 2023 uses Edmunds data. And so we can see that the darker blue line, this excludes Tesla. And we can see that when we exclude Tesla, the lease rates are higher, as Tesla doesn't offer discounted lease contracts, so therefore they tend to have lower lease rates. And from this figure, we can see that leasing overall peaked in 2016 and over time was decreasing, with brands that had previously high lease rates such as Volkswagen and Ford, as well as luxury brands such as BMW, decreasing over time. And we also see in 2018 the introduction of Tesla Model 3. And we can see here that when we exclude Tesla, the lease rate does decline, but not nearly as drastically as when Tesla is included. And this sort of demonstrates the market penetration of Tesla, the overall market share. And so leasing continued to decline from 2020 to 2022. And this overall could be tied to overall, both in the conventional vehicle market and the electric vehicle market, overall higher vehicle prices and higher interest rates, which was discouraging consumers to re-enter the vehicle market every 3 years. And also could be tied to tighter vehicle supply. We do, however, see that in 2023, the PEV lease rate has increased to about 35%. And this could be attributable to the loophole, the IRA loophole, which has been heavily advertised by automakers. So now I'll transition into talking about a study which investigates the binary decision to either purchase or lease a PEV. And this comes from a survey of approximately 9,400 PEV owners who purchased or leased a PEV from 2011 to 2018, but who were surveyed between 2015 to 2018. And these were PEV owners who had applied for the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project and then were solicited to take this survey. We analyzed the factors which are correlated with the decision to purchase or lease a PEV, with the dependent variable being either purchase or lease. And as shown below, the variables were motivated both by literature on PEV adoption and also vehicle contract choice. And for like more details about the variables and their motivation, I would refer you to our 2022 paper, which gets into more details on these variables. But to capture the attractiveness of the lease contract, over on the right, we include the lease cost to MSRP ratio. And the lease cost includes all the down and monthly payments as a proportion of the MSRP. So a lower ratio would indicate a more attractive lease contract. And then we have some vehicle characteristics, such as a dummy variable for either being a BEV, meaning a full battery electric vehicle, or a PHEV, meaning a plug-in hybrid. And then we have an interaction effect with the PEV type with electric range, shown on the left. And then we also have some socio-demographics, such as single family home and owning a home and having solar installed, as well as commute distance, and then some others, including income, college education, and then lastly, there's we include the stated importance of two incentives, the state rebate and the HOV lane. So jumping right into the results, these are shown as the statistically significant variables which increase the odds of either purchasing or leasing a PEV. And so over on the right, we see that BEVs compared to PHEVs are more likely to be leased. But shown on the left, we can see that as the electric range of BEVs increases, they're more likely to be purchased. And then below that, we see that as the lease cost increases as a proportion of the MSRP, the PEV is also more likely to be purchased. And then we also have home ownership and living in a single family home, as well as having solar installed, being correlated with purchasing a PEV. And then lastly, we have higher stated importance of the state rebate being associated with purchasing, whereas higher stated importance of the HOV lane is associated with leasing. And then lastly, I will note too, we included a variable for financier. And while from 2011 to 2018, on average, the model showed leasing to be increasing over time, as I previously showed in the trends. Leasing then continued to decrease. So this model was really only able to reflect the data years available. And so now moving on into looking into the impact of the federal tax credit for purchasers and lessees. And so to do this, we're using the same survey of PEV owners, but from a later year. These PEV owners were surveyed in 2019, but could have purchased or leased through PEV from 2018 to 2019. And we analyze responses to a question about potential adoption decisions in the absence of the federal tax credit, and we model purchasers and lessees separately. So to discuss like how the data was screened, because this was done differently for purchasers and lessees. So for purchasers, they were first asked to rate each of the incentives, and this was used to create a rank order of all of the financial incentives. And only purchasers who selected the federal tax credit as their _1 ranked financial incentive were asked the choice question. Alternatively, lessees were not asked to rank the federal tax credit. As I previously mentioned, we didn't think lessees were aware of the federal tax credit. And so all lessees were asked this choice question with the exception of Tesla and Chevrolet. And this was because the data was collected during the period of the incentive phase out for these two brands, and therefore there was more uncertainty about the incentive amount received during this time. And so for purchasers, they were asked if the tax credit were not available when buying my plug-in vehicle or any other plug-in vehicle, I would have chosen one of the following, and I'll show the options on the next slide. Whereas for lessees, we first provide information about the federal tax credit being applied to their lease cost, and then calculate for them what their lease cost would have been without the federal tax credit. And then ask them if that would have been the case, I would have chosen one of the following. So the responses are as follows. So they have the option to either not change, meaning that they would still choose the same PEV in the absence of the tax credit, or maybe they would choose another PEV, no vehicle at all, perhaps a conventional or non-plug-in vehicle. And then lastly, lessees were also given the additional option of purchasing the PEV with no equivalent for purchasers. And so we can see from the distribution of responses that there's a higher proportion of purchasers who would not change their decision in the absence of the tax credit, whereas a higher proportion of lessees would switch to either a conventional vehicle or another PEV. And this could demonstrate that the incentive is perhaps more influential for lessees' decision compared to purchasers, given that there's fewer, or like given that there's more uncertainty for purchasers as to when they're receiving the credit amount and how much they'll receive. And then over on the right, we have the different choice alternatives as they are in the model. And over on the left for purchasers, all of the results, which I will present on the next slide, will be relative to not changing their decision. And whereas for lessees, due to having a lower amount of observations, we combine another PEV category with no change for the reference category of leasing a PEV, whether it be the same or another PEV. And here are the variables that we controlled for in the model. The incentive is controlled for through the discount percent. And so for lessees, we apply the full applicable incentive, and we divide that by what the lease cost would have been without the tax credit. And for purchasers, we divide the incentive that they received, and we get this information from the survey. We ask them how much the incentive was worth for them, and then we divide this by the MSRP. And then we again have vehicle characteristics such as a dummy variable for either BEV or PHEV, as well as MSRP and electric range, and a dummy variable for either being financed in 2018 or 2019. And then some sociodemographics, such as home ownership, number of drivers per vehicle, and income, as well as male distinction and age. And now to get into the results, these are presented as the statistically significant variables which increase the odds of choosing one of the following alternatives relative to not changing your decision in the absence of the federal tax credit. And this is the model for lessees. And so we find that as the discount from the tax credit increases as a proportion of the total lease costs, lessees would be more likely in the absence of the tax credit to choose a conventional or no vehicle at all. We also find effects for MSRP. So we find that lower priced PEVs in the absence of the tax credit are more likely to choose a conventional vehicle, or I should say lessees of lower priced MSRP vehicles are more likely to choose a conventional vehicle in the absence of the tax credit. And then we also find that households with more vehicles available per driver in the absence of the tax credit are more likely to not lease any vehicle at all or to purchase the PEV. In regard to home ownership, we find that lessees who rent rather than own their home are more likely to choose either a conventional vehicle or to purchase the PEV in the absence of the tax credit. And then lastly, for some sociodemographics, we find that being male is associated with leasing a conventional vehicle in the absence of the tax credit, as well as being younger, whereas being older is associated with choosing to purchase the PEV. And so the purchaser model has a few more statistically significant variables. And so starting again with the discount percent, we see that as the incentive increases as a proportion of MSRP, in the absence of the tax credit, purchasers are more likely to choose either another PEV, no vehicle, or a conventional vehicle. And in regard to electric range, we find that shorter BEVs with shorter electric range is associated with either choosing another PEV or a conventional vehicle in the absence of the tax credit. But PHEVs, on the other hand, exhibit a different effect. So as the electric range of PHEVs increases, in the absence of the tax credit, purchasers are more likely not to purchase any vehicle at all or to choose another PEV. In regard to finance here, we find that relative to 2018, purchasers in 2019 would be more likely in the absence of the tax credit to either finance a conventional or another PEV. And again, we find an effect for renting rather than owning a home, with purchasers also who rent more likely to choose a conventional vehicle. And then lastly, the sociodemographics. So we have some effects there with being male and age, which I won't delve into. And then again, we find that households with more vehicles per driver in the absence of the tax credit would be more likely not to choose any vehicle at all. And then lastly, for income, we find that relative to those with an income of 200,000 and above, those with an income of 100 to 199,000 would be more likely to choose a conventional vehicle in the absence of the tax credit. Whereas those with an income of 200,000 or more would be more likely to choose another rather than the same PEV in the absence of the tax credit relative to lower income groups. And so this figure here shows a visual of the impact of the federal tax credit for lessees, with the y-axis being showing the probability of choosing the various alternatives. And we can see that as the discount percent increases as a percent of the lease costs, in the absence of the federal tax credit, lessees would be more likely to choose no vehicle at all or to lease a conventional vehicle, while the probability of leasing a PEV or purchasing the PEV decreases. And so now to discuss the results, first from the binary model of the purchase and lease decision. We find the results from the contract characteristics demonstrate that automakers / dealerships may be successful in using favorable lease terms as defined as a low lease cost to the MSRP ratio in driving demand for leasing. In regard to vehicle characteristics, the finding of BEVs being more likely to be leased could demonstrate that PHEVs could be perceived as having fewer uncertainties relative to BEVs, and short range BEVs in particular could be seen as risky ownership. And the high rate of lease BEVs could have, or of the high rate of low range BEVs could have implications for the type of PEVs entering the used market. However, I think it's important to note here, similarly with the limitations of the financier for this study, this study was also, goes from 2011 to 2018, which does include a period of time when average electric range was fairly low with, popular models such as Nissan Leaf, whereas now electric range has increased quite drastically. And then, lastly, for the household characteristics, we found that leasing was more associated with renting and not living in a single family home. And so while leasing could increase access to PEVs for renters, access to home charging could be a barrier for these consumers. And so now to discuss the results from the federal tax credit models. In regard to contract characteristics, the results demonstrated that the federal tax credit supports the adoption of PEVs and encourage respondents to purchase or lease a PEV. And in regard to vehicle characteristics, we find in regard to the finding of MSRP and lower MSRP vehicle or lessees of lower priced MSRP vehicles being more likely to choose a conventional vehicle in the absence of the tax credit could demonstrate that buyers of higher priced PEVs may be less reliant on incentives. So while the loophole for the IRA loophole for leasing PEVs may have a positive benefit on the overall PEV market, the MSRP caps could still be a good way to ensure that those who are most reliant on the incentives are the ones receiving them. And then we also find that purchasers of higher range BEVs are less likely to be reliant on incentives, whereas this is not the case for purchasers of higher range PHEVs who are more likely to choose no vehicle at all in the absence of the tax credit as range increases. And then lastly, for household characteristics, while the binary model showed that lessees were more likely than purchasers to rent rather than own their home, both of the federal tax credit models show that purchasers and lessees who rent are more likely to choose a conventional vehicle over a plug-in electric. And now, lastly, I want to discuss some policy implications of these findings. So firstly, as previously mentioned, PEV leasing is an important part of the market to increase the turnover of vehicles entering the used market, to increase the accessibility of PEVs to a wider group of consumers. And secondly, the larger the tax credit relative to the MSRP or lease price, the more important the incentive is in persuading purchasers and lessees to choose a PEV. And the descriptive statistics do also show that the tax credit may be more influential for lessees' purchasing decisions. Therefore, it could be beneficial to inform potential lessees about available incentives. And this does appear to be the case with the IRA. As I showed earlier, there's a large proliferation of automakers now advertising leasing. And incentives should also be directed toward less expensive PEVs, regardless as range, as has been done with MSRP caps. And as I mentioned earlier, this would increase the equitable distribution of incentives. And the findings related to home ownership, which could be related to homeowners having easier access to charging installation, could demonstrate that additional incentives which defrayed the cost of charger installation could also help with the transition to PEVs for those not living in a single family home. And lastly, we need future surveys to incorporate not just the federal tax credit, but bundled together with all available incentives, in addition to looking at the impact of incentives for used PEVs, which this study did not. And so with that, I will end my presentation, and thank you all for listening, and I am happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kelly. That was great. And let's see, we do have, well, the first question that we have in the chat is, will the slides be available to download? And yes, they definitely will. I will post the link to the webinar event page in the chat. And then we have another question that I thought we could answer live. The question is, was any calculation estimate of price elasticity of demand made for purchasing or leasing PEVs to look at optimizing subsidized incentive amounts?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, no, this model doesn't exactly look into optimizing the incentive amount or like looking into how or if incentive amounts should be like shifted between purchasers and lessees. Yeah, and that's because we weren't able to like directly compare the two models due to like the differences in the survey instrument. But that's definitely a good research direction.
Okay, and then we will keep an eye on the Q&A in case other questions come in there, but we did receive quite a few during the registration process. Oh, and we have a hand raised, actually. Let's see here. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute the person who raised their hand. Let's see if this works. Okay, Marie, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, Kelly, it looked like on one of your models that the Tesla, you didn't show any data for Tesla. I think after Tesla leasing after 2020, does Tesla not offer leasing?
Yeah, well, that was because of the different data sources we used. So
Oh,
from
okay.
20 sorry, I'm trying to, yeah, from 2011 to 2019 we had our survey data, and then these come from Edmunds, which includes all PEVs. Yeah.
Okay. So Tesla does offer it. I'm one of the EV managers for the Clean Cars for All program, and Tesla is, I think, greater than 50% of our clients get that. So if leasing is available for them, that would be a great direction to point them to. So thank you.
Tesla is the one company that their lease offers is not as appealing as the other companies. So they do offer a lease, but it's much less appealing than all the other OEMs. And if you look at the share of lease and purchase, Tesla have much higher purchase than any other car company in the market. It's not that they're not offering it; it's just not a very a good deal to lease from Tesla.
Got it. Thank you, Dr. Tal.
All right, excellent. So I'm going to jump over to some of the questions that we received during registration. The first one I have here is, can you still get the federal tax credit without income restrictions if you lease, and even if it is not made in the US? And I'll post the question in the chat too, just so folks can read it.
Yeah, so that is true, that if you lease the PEV, then none of the income or MSRP caps apply, and same with the manufacturing. Yeah, which I was surprised by. At first I thought it was not all of them, but yeah, it's it's a true loophole, which just to expand on further, has been criticized by some online articles, sort of arguing that this policy sort of perpetuates the idea of EVs being for the rich. But as we've sort of been discussing, encouraging leasing also does have positive benefits for the secondary market as well. But yeah, and again, I think the origins of this loophole was intended to benefit business owners who they didn't want to discourage from leasing, and so but it still applies to just consumers.
Okay, and we have another hand raised, so I'm going to ask Byron to unmute. Byron, did you want to ask your question live? Okay, well, maybe for now we can move on to a different question. Feel free to ask it in the chat as well. So another one that we have, and I'll put this in the chat, is Do we know if different adopter categories, like innovators, early adopters, et cetera, value leasing versus purchasing differently?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I don't think so. As we discussed earlier, so or maybe I'll start with what we found in the conventional vehicle market is that leasing has been found to be attractive to people who prefer a variety. So again, that's the shorter ownership period. And also has been speculated to be a way for higher income consumers in particular to sort of upgrade their technology every few years. And yeah, just to note, we haven't found any income effects with lessees like having higher income. But yeah, as we discussed as well, with leasing, it does allow you to anticipate technology improvements, which for PEVs, most notably like anticipating increases in electric range, which could encourage early adoption, but I don't know if specifically like lessees belong to like this innovator category, because I think leasing could be connected to other lifestyle characteristics, such as in our model renting, and it could be consumers who just prefer shorter term ownership periods overall, unconnected to innovation. But yeah, definitely interesting question.
All right, thanks, Kelly. And I'll put another one in the chat here. How are you calculating the substitution effects between 30D and 45W?
So the 30D is what I interpret to just be the sort of standard IRA eligibility requirements. And the 45W is basically just the classification of commercial vehicles, which is like what I was discussing earlier with leased PEVs being classified as a commercial vehicle, so that it's sort of accounted for in well, actually it's not, it's the IRA, the model does not account, the model is not a model of the impact of the IRA. So we weren't, the model it was during before the IRA. So yeah, it's more just relevant policy context.
Okay, thank you. Popping another one in here. Does the tax credit have to be paid back later if a consumer's tax liability is less than $7,500?
No, they just don't receive the full amount. And that's where the new 2024 rule, where you can where purchasers will be able to transfer the entire credit regardless of their tax liability to a dealership, which, as I mentioned, is good for consumers who didn't have high enough tax liability. However, I think this too will have some, barriers of entry, including, finding an eligible dealership, and then to the fact that a lot of lower income buyers don't even buy vehicles at the dealership, but from other places. So yeah, while there have been some positive changes in like the in the tax credit, not being a regressive policy, but I think still this won't necessarily solve all the problems, because as I mentioned earlier, it has to be an eligible dealership, and so there could be issues with finding the dealership and that sort of thing.
Okay, and then I'll put another question in here. How long will these subsidies continue to be offered to corporations in the US?
I believe the IRA goes until 2032, and yeah, and after that, yeah, I think it will be interesting to see what happens. With the clean vehicle rebate project, that was a rebate, as I introduced at the beginning, that was offered in California. And that was like 2,000 to 2,500 for a full battery electric vehicle. So a smaller incentive than the tax credit, but this was retired as of this year. And yeah, I'm not sure what incentives will be next, or like what they'll I think that kind of, yeah, if Gil wants to comment on that.
I will. I think it's a very important question, and we are trying to study it from different angles. The need for incentives is still here, but the reason is changing over time. If in early years, when the market in California is innovators only, and we only start moving out of the innovators in the last year or two, I think, and in the most of the US, we are still there. The main motivation was to change people purchase behavior. So we were giving money so consumer will buy these cars. When we have more and more supply policies, the ZEV mandate, the EPA CO2 regulation, and so on, we will have to reconsider who get these incentives, not in order to change behavior, but in order to make sure that everyone is benefiting from it. So it will be more an equity question, total cost of ownership question. So the reason for the incentives will change. It's already changing to, as we talked about in IRA, to benefit local supply. So it's not just about the buyers, it's also about the manufacturers and so on. So we are going to see a lot of changes, but I don't think it's going to disappear soon, for sure not before 2032. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Gil. And I just wanted to point out that someone has offered in the Q&A that for questions about the IRA tax credits, refer to the official IRS information, and a link is provided there. So thank you to whoever posted that. And we are coming up at the end of the hour. So Gil or Kelly, do you have any final thoughts you want to share? I think that was a good close.
I'll just close by I found it you know, I was researching leasing before the IRA, and it's been sort of interesting sort of how it's become more relevant, and also yeah, it's just an interesting transition point in the PEV market overall. So yeah.
All right. Well, a big thank you to everyone who called in and participated today. And thank you, Gil and Kelly, for sharing this really interesting and timely research. We really appreciate it.